12,000 BC, we began to domesticate animals, beginning with wolves and the dogs. 10,000 BC, we started to settle down, plant crops, the agricultural revolution, kind of the fork in the road of our narrative. 4,000 BC, the wheel. 9th century AD, gunpowder. Bit of a game changer then. 15th century, the printing press. 19th century, the beginning of the 19th century, human population hits 1 billion people for the first time. It took all of human history. Homo sapiens been around 200,000 years. Our ancestors been around about 6 million years. All that time to get to 1 billion, the year 1804. Later in that century, Eureka, the light bulb. 20th century, automobile, television, nuclear weapons, spacecraft, internet. 21st century, nanotech, biotech, fission, fusion, and the completion of the Human Genome Project, which traces our ancestry all the way back to Africa. Now, what does that have to do with the roots of any injustice, in particular, racism? Well, I ended with going back to Africa. I spent some time in Uganda. My parents belonged to a church that was going on a pilgrimage there, and they had some extra space. I was doing a fair amount of traveling at the time, and I wanted to go along. And so I went with them. And it was generally a bunch of people who were mainly white and well-traveled. But when I say well-traveled, their experience of traveling was generally going to a country and staying in a resort that was generally gated. And then they would go on tours. This wasn't the case. This was not a vacation, it was a pilgrimage. And what they were doing was going around to different hospitals, clinics, schools, and visiting children, and really bringing supplies to people who were in poverty. It was a very interesting trip, to say the least. We went to one school in particular, and every place we went, we were generally treated like rock stars. And it became uncomfortable, not because of the way we were being treated, but by the reactions of the people I was with. I was sitting there, and one of the group of children was putting on a presentation with their teachers. And I had a video camera, so I was filming, and the people I were with, was about 30 of us, were sitting in the crowd, and there's about 5 students and some teachers, and they're reciting a poem. And I had my camera up, and one part of the poem, and I had the children had heavy accents. It's a former British colony. They had heavy accents, and the children said, along with their teachers, reciting in unison, they said, "Thank you, white people, for clothing us and taking away our boredom." And my wife was sitting in front of me, and she turned around and she goes, "Did you hear that?" And I was like, "Yeah." And all the people around me didn't blink an eye. They were all like, "Oh yeah," like kind of like, "You're welcome." And at that point, something shifted in my narrative. At that point, I realized that at least the particular culture I came from somewhat created the idea of boredom and the cure. You know, I come from a world of Facebook, Twitter, iPads, iTunes, iPods, planes, trains, and automobiles. Anything I want, generally at any time. And here were kids with no shoes, and were thanking us for bringing them some items and for taking away their boredom. And I started to think back about our story and when the concept of boredom became the concept of boredom, and what that has to do, if anything, with racial injustice. And so I kept trying to peel back layer upon layer upon layer of what was happening to me. And this is 5 years ago. Our living arrangement, which is our narrative, requires, as far as I can tell, not only environmental degradation, but injustice to function daily. And I started to realize this just from because I live in such a rural area, just from ordering something. Because where I live, I have to walk to get internet access. And the closest town is about 35 to 25 miles, depending on what store you're going to go to. And in order to go places, I generally have to know if somebody's going to drive in there, and I tag along and go with them. And so I order things online once in a while. And this is a brief narrative of just the delivery system that took place for a pair of shoes. And this is just the United States version of it. Before shoes ever arrived in the United States, I didn't see any of what happened and how they were manufactured and how they got to me. And so the hidden relationships I'm talking about is where the injustice stems from, because if you go farther back in our narrative, we knew where our things came from because we either created them or somebody in our close community created them. Now, we have no idea. I mean, sure, we do things, we look at things and we go, oh, that's organic, or that's local, or that's free range, and so on and so forth. But when it comes to most of the things in our lives, you start to see a little bit of the insanity of getting a pair of shoes and the amount of people that it touches and the fossil fuel use that it requires. And then you start to ask yourself, okay, let's just take one item that most people have today, electronics. This is an older iPad. Either people have something like that maybe around here, or they have a cell phone or something similar. And if we look at that, well, let's think about where it comes from. Do we take in consideration the injustice that may take place to get that item to us? Maybe racial injustice, if we just focus on that, the roots of racism. Do we consider maybe, if it's electronics, what are the materials that are being mined? And what does that do to the local environment? What does that do to the miners that are working there? And how are they being paid? And are they working in safe conditions? Because we have to save money on this product because we have to make a profit. And so we don't think about necessarily the miners. Or maybe then it's shipped and it's starting to be produced by poor women, let's say in Southeast Asia, poor women of color. And maybe the materials that they're handling potentially give them cancer because maybe they're working in a place that doesn't have something like OSHA or unions or any sort of representation because they have to eat and they have to make money. Then we put it on a ship. Again, we don't know anything about the production of this particular transportation piece, who's running it, where it comes from, how it's affected that particular community, and then it shows up in a giant warehouse, and the story begins that I showed you on the page. It shows up on our West Coast usually, in a huge warehouse where people are working maybe for about 15 bucks an hour. And sometimes they get a bathroom break. And then massive trucks come, pick that up, and they drive it for fossil fuel use. We don't know anything about the drivers. It shows up to a big box store, like a Costco or a Walmart. And then we go buy it, probably from an underpaid employee in a well-lit, air-conditioned box store. Again, all this stuff just kind of happens. And then we buy it, and then we may use it for a couple years until we get a free upgrade. And then we get rid of it. We think maybe it's getting recycled. We don't know. We just kind of assume. And it may end up, I don't know, in a landfill. Not where I live, but where poor people live. And then it may poison some drinking water. And then lawsuits begin, and maybe after decades, something gets resolved after a bunch of people have been impacted by that. That's what I'm talking about, hidden relationships. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about our collective narrative. But can we see the narrative? It's like fish in water. If you're born in water, do you notice the water? Do you notice the very thing that keeps you alive? Do we notice a narrative that we are born into? If you are born into a particular living arrangement where you go to a store, things show up on the shelves, and you buy them, water comes out of your municipal tap when you turn the knob. If you want a house, you buy it or you rent. Do you know any other way of living? And is there actually considered to be any other way of living? And do we consider how that connects to the injustice that we're talking about at this particular conference, which is racial injustice? I don't know. I was born, like most of you, into the industrial model. That's all I know. I have since, in the last 5 years, crawled, inched, scratched, trying to move towards the exit of it. It's not going to happen. I don't know how to be a hunter-gatherer. I don't necessarily have any what I would call useful skills for survival. I know what most of you know. Get a job, pay somebody to get my stuff, my human basic needs to me, and my particular wants. So, this is kind of what it looks like. We have our basic human needs, food, water, shelter. We're the only species that I know of that locks up the food. We have to pay to live on the planet. Not always. In human history, this is a very small window. The food wasn't always locked up. You didn't always have to have a job to eat. And so when we talk about injustice, when we talk about poverty, well, we're talking about a massive hierarchy here. We're talking about institutions, collections of institutions that make up larger systems. And those larger systems make up our living arrangement. And when you have a hierarchy where most of it's hidden from us, we don't know necessarily who's touched our stuff, where it's come from, and how it's affected them, then we don't know about the injustice. And we don't connect the racial injustice that's happening, or the patriarchy, or the classism. Because we live in a monoculture. It's a growth culture. We believe in bad math. We believe in infinite growth on a finite planet. I'm not a math guy, but I'm pretty sure that doesn't add up. We put 1 billion people on the planet now every 12 years. We went from 6 million years to put 1 billion on to 1 dozen. It's not on the news. We don't talk about that. We don't talk about what type of living arrangement they're going to pursue and the cost that has on not only our species, but all of the species that support our lives. Because justice isn't just about us, although we think it is. It's about everything. And so when people say we're multicultural, we're not. We're a monoculture. We pursue growth. We talk about the economy. I was watching a Bill Maher episode on HBO, Real Time with Bill Maher, and he has a little panel, and they were talking about climate change, and 2 of the panelists said, listen, I'm not going to consider any reforms on climate change if it affects the economy. These are supposedly smart people. They don't understand that there is no economy without a planet. So, if you're just going to ignore climate change, well then you're not really going to have an economy. I don't think we're making connections that are necessary in order to pursue the justice that we want, because this is the kind of stuff I hear. You can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. You're obviously not an economist. And so it gets to the point where, for me, when I look at anything, generally on television, the news, it doesn't matter if it's Fox or NPR, because at the end of the day, when you get down to the collective story we tell ourselves about ourselves, it's the same thing. It's about growth. It's about employment. It's about injustice and what do we do to fix it. But we seem to do everything except question the very thing that creates it. We tweak it, twist it, negotiate with it, but we never actually address the root.